Hi, I want to say welcome to all of you who are joining our panel today. And I want to let you know that we will be taking your questions at the end of the session. For those of you who are interested in giving us questions, please use the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. Also, as a reminder today, we will be recording, so everyone but our panelists are muted to minimize the interruptions. So now let's get started. Let me introduce myself. I'm Corinne Mason, and I'm a partner with a company called Summit Leadership Partners. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Summit Leadership Partners is a consultancy focused on increasing growth and value through leadership. We help investors, boards, and executives to accelerate performance in today's dynamic business climate by providing strategic clarity and practical solutions required to quickly scale top leaders and their teams. Our event today is focused on gaining wisdom and guidance from our esteemed panel of human resource leaders around how they have had to navigate the challenges of 2020. And what a year it has been. Specifically, we will be asking about how they have faced the COVID-19 pandemic, the increasing call for equity and social justice, among other challenges. They will also share with us what they are anticipating next and how they're already thinking about 2021. I'll now begin to introduce each of our panelists, starting with Susan Edwards. Susan is the Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer for Sealed Air. Sealed Air is the company possibly most famously known for bubble wrap. However, the Sealed Air of today brings together packaging materials, equipment, services, and automation to provide essential protection for products and people. Susan is responsible for all human resource operations worldwide and oversees Sealed Air's culture, talent, total rewards, and employer brand strategy with a heightened focus on inclusion and diversity. She is also responsible for the company's social responsibility and global communications efforts aimed at reaching and engaging the current and future employees, media, community partners around the world. Susan has her MA in International Business and her BA in Human Resource Management. Welcome, Susan. Our next panelist is Robin Mingle. Robin is the SVP and Chief Human Resource Officer for CommScope, an $8 billion Hickory, North Carolina-based global leader in infrastructure solutions for communications networks. If you're talking, texting, emailing, or on the internet like we all are right now, it's likely that your communications are being made possible by solutions from CommScope. Prior to CommScope, Robin served as a CHRO for two other big companies. She has an MS in Industrial Organizational Psychology and a BA in Psychology. Welcome, Robin. Our next panelist is Camila Mitchell-Thomas. Camila is the Chief People Officer of Dow Jones, where she guides the company culture through the strategic application of people power for digital transformation, change execution, cultivating partnerships with key stakeholders, business leaders, and cross-functional teams. She has over 20 years of extensive human resource experience. And interestingly enough, she began her career at JP Morgan as a financial analyst. Camila has a BA in economics. Welcome, Camila. And last but never least is Terry Zanheis. Terry has the enviable position of Chief People Officer for Krispy Kreme, which in my humble opinion are the best donuts in the entire world. Terry is a seasoned HR leader who is passionate about building teams and developing talent. She has extensive career and experience and includes prior leadership roles at Bank of America, AOL, and eBay. Terry has a BA in organizational management. So welcome to all of our panelists. I will begin asking each of our panelists to answer our first question, and then we'll move through our additional questions. For those of you who are just joining the webinar, just a reminder that we will have about 15 minutes at the end of this session for Q&A, and you can enter your Q&A questions at the bottom of your screen on the Q&A chat. We look forward to fielding those questions. All right, panelists, question number one. Susan, I'll ask you to start, and then I'll have the rest of the group kind of chime in. Our first question is, given everything that's gone on this year, what's been the biggest learning for you personally, as well as for your business? Oh,
sorry, it's now unmuted. So
Okay.
there's been so much learning this year, and I think everybody feels the same way. Personally, I think my learning was that initially when the pandemic happened and the lockdown happened, there was actually this period of time in which there was this much needed rebalancing. Things slowed down a little bit. You got a chance to kind of work from home, and I was surprised maybe at how much I needed that. But very quickly, my learning was that I really value being interactive and face to face, and getting on a plane and getting a chance to really interact with people personally. It was a great little segue to kind of rebalance things. But I found how much I've learned how much I really need that, maybe more than I even realized. Professionally, it really has accelerated our flex work. We were already having a conversation about how we could create a global, flexible, policy and practice. And there were so many paradigms that were in our way. And, half of the organization felt it would never work. The other half of the organization said, we ought to just shoot the moon and see what we can do with it. It was this great accelerator. We call it the grand experiment, in which it really did propel a lot of the paradigms to now say, you know what, it was easier than we thought it was. We know there are pitfalls to doing this long term, but let's work through that and see what we need to do. And suddenly we were in a place where we could experiment, and everyone was along for the ride. So I think those were our great learnings, is that this can be done.
Yeah, I hear you around the acceleration of that. Thank you, Susan. How about Robin? Robin, can you answer the question too?
Sure, thanks, Corinne, and thanks for having me today. So I guess when I reflect on this, I can't ever remember a time when having clarity around my own personal values and my company's values have been so centrally important to navigating this environment that we've been in. So many decisions have had to be made, right? If we think on a professional level, and the organizations are looking to us to help guide decisions. I mean, from day one when this began. And, so I'm so thankful. I'm going to talk a little bit later about values and culture and why it was so important. But our organization, we're very clear about our values, particularly even more recently. And so that really helped us to shape and make those decisions, and people could come to trust and rely on, and not be surprised by what those decisions were. And I think that gave people stock in how things would unfold, right? It was expected. And on a personal level, we're seeing it play out every day. Do I wear a mask? Do I don't wear a mask? What do I do? Do I welcome people or, and so again, I think that personal insight, has been really important for all of us to guide the decisions that we make every day personally, and how we make the most of it, and how we, take care of others or ourselves. And so that one for me, the values is the big, hallmark of this year. The only other thing I'd add, because I think it's important and relevant for the audience, is these jobs can be particularly lonely when you're alone. And as the situation was unfolding in Asia and starting in Europe, and we're a very big global company, I right away said, oh my God, I'm not doing this alone. And I sent out an email to a couple of dozen CHROs that were global and just said, hey, you guys want to start huddling and sharing? And so this is before lots of other, maybe, right, started to build those bridges. And so we already had an instant group that it was really important, because our CEOs and our leadership teams were looking to us for confidence in what we're recommending for decision making. And as we were all navigating it, guess what? We were all, pretty well aligned around some of the right decisions. And so again, just encouraging people to, leverage those networks. It really has helped me personally. And look at, here we are today, right? Still sharing. And so that's, I think, central to, the learning. Don't let those networks, go, and don't go it alone if you don't have to.
That's great. Values and having support. I can appreciate both of those things. Camila, how about you?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and be with this panel. I think similarly with Robin, it really allows for you to be very decisive about what matters, right? Both personally and from a workplace perspective. And for Dow Jones, which is home of Wall Street Journal and Barron's and other news publications and an information business, we were at the epicenter of making sure that we were getting people information that they needed to really respond to the COVID crisis, both individually and in the business context. And so really being very clear, it allowed us a chance to declutter and to really be focused and expedite on the things that really truly matter. And so I think the surprise learning was that we realized there was a lot of things we were doing that were not necessarily moving the needle. And we were really allowed to really quickly kind of clear the deck, so to speak, to really focus in this really important time. And I think, personally, that was something that I was allowed to do because now we have a greater focus on what really matters, right? Our families, being able to really think about self-care, which is really important. And I think the other learning is that we saw that people were really having, burning out and work seemed to be more intense, not less intense, right? Even though you didn't have the commute and you didn't have these other challenges. And so it really put us, into a really acute focus on the employee experience and how they were experiencing the work, which is, I think, has allowed us to really focus on what is the future of work on a post-COVID context. So it has allowed us to be creative and to really use this as a learning moment to really focus on the employee experience and come out of this a lot more, certainly healthier, stronger as an organization.
Yeah, I love that clarity of focus and focus on the employees in the process and being healthier. That's a big challenge. Thank you for that. Terry, what's
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what my colleagues have said here. I think one of the things that we've talked about is the once seemingly impossible quickly became possible. And whether it was just testing some of the paradigms that we had within the organization around the ability to, in fact, be productive when you're working virtually, or jobs that could never be part-time could actually be part-time. I think we also really pivoted quickly on how we had to reinvent servicing our customers while keeping our employees, or what we call Krispy Kremers, safe, and the ability to think about that really quickly and pivoting really quickly. So we learned a lot about ourselves. We learned a lot about the resilience of our brand and about our ability to mobilize quickly. I think on a personal level, I would echo what Susan said. I've known I was an extrovert coming into this, but it certainly has affirmed that and sort of how I get my energy. And even though I am at home with my most favorite people in the entire world, 24/7, 6 months, test all of that from a personal stamina level as well. And I think to Camilla's point, that's also what we're seeing with our employees. I don't think anyone anticipated this would be as long a haul as it's turning out to be. And so once the flexibility provided in terms of energy and a chance to regroup and work differently, now I think we're struggling with finding those boundaries and how do you make sure that you don't lose sight of those. And I think last but not least, personally, I learned that you can in fact be late for a meeting even if you don't have to go anywhere. So that's been a good challenge as well.
That's so true. And I have to say thank you for having comfort food during all of this as well. I really appreciate that. All right, Terry, I'm going to throw this next question your way too. So for many, fiscal year 2020 revenue and profitability forecasting was thrown out the window in March due to the economic realities of COVID-19. How have you navigated your approach to performance management while also managing the expectations with investors, boards, and others?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think to your point, Krispy Kreme is a little bit uniquely positioned from a brand perspective because we are situated right now to bring joy and bring smiles and provide people with an indulgent moment and a bit of a reprieve when needed most. And we probably underestimated the impact of that going into this. So certainly there was an initial moment of panic as across the board in terms of what the impact was going to be on our businesses. And we are owned by a private equity firm, but we do have an internal board. And like all of us, really key stakeholders. So when we think about performance management, we re-bucketed it in a few different ways. One was really recognizing how do we capitalize on some of the things that we are just lucky to have. As I mentioned, being fortunate around being a sweet treat at this particular point in time really benefited us. The other thing was we made a decision to launch delivery in February. So national delivery across the board. And while it was the best laid plans, it turned out to really be lucky. And so we needed to figure out how to ramp that up and leverage that more fully. Then there was an opportunity, as I mentioned, to really pivot. So when we thought about how we manage the performance of the business and how to rally our Krispy Kremers as well, it was, what do we do to uniquely respond to what's going on at this point in time? So we threw out some of our traditional playbooks, and we did things like creating what we called acts of joy. So it gave us an opportunity to connect the brand with the people that were responding and very much on the front lines of what was going on. We created Healthcare Mondays, where if you were a healthcare worker, you could show up at Krispy Kreme, show an ID, and get free donuts, as many as you needed to bring back to the hospital or to the clinic. We also really wanted to recognize some of the lost moments that were going on. So we launched a campaign around our 2020 graduates from high school and college, enabled them, again, to come to the shops, put on your cap and gown, and try to have a celebratory moment with the brand. We also did some things about recognizing we can't see our neighbors and friends the way that we used to. So we launched Be Sweet Saturdays, which was a way to grab donuts for yourself and take a sealed dozen and drop them on the front porch of your neighbors. This was really an extension of our brand, but it caused us to do it in a much more nimble way. And I think we turned a lot of the premises that we had going into it on its side. And so this was a whole new way of thinking about how we manage the performance of the business. And then last but not least, I would describe as kind of staying the course, because there were definitely things that we had in our business plan that we did not want to stray away from. So we launched our flagship store in Times Square just about a month ago. We opened 2 other New York stores. We have plans to open 4 more before the year's out. And we did all of this in the course of a pandemic. And so I think with the right leadership and focus on really staying the course, we shifted how we were thinking about managing performance, describing performance. But all that said, there's still a vulnerability here. So one of the things we've also had to demonstrate to our board and our stakeholders is that we've got a line of sight around the things, the what ifs. There's a lot of things that we've learned over the last 6 months, but we also recognize there's still a lot of unknowns as we go forward. So really being able to demonstrate, looking ahead, planning ahead, and putting some things in place that we think are going to help us really buffer some of those challenges.
That's great. I hear that word focus. I hear the word pivot, which I think we hear a lot in response to this. And I love the idea of engaging and incentivizing employees to be part of the solution. That was really brilliant too. Thank you for sharing that, Terry. Next question, I'm going to start with Susan. Good or bad, crisis tests the strength and the resilience of the organizational culture. How have the events of the first half of 2020 tested your company's culture, and how did you respond to what you learned?
So we have starting out by, most of our employees, about 60% of our employees, work and live in countries outside of the U.S. And even within the U.S., we have about 50 different sites. And so, everyone was working virtually to each other across the company already. And so, that in itself wasn't different, but somehow it was still different. And so, we had been hearing that there was concern that we were too U.S. centric. We needed to be more internationally, equal. We needed to kind of present ourselves very differently. And then when you fast forward into now everybody's virtual and everyone's concerned, of course, how you're going to stay connected. And it really was interesting because it elevated the fact that this was a U.S. concern from U.S. employees and how we were going to stay connected. But it had always been a concern from our international colleagues. And we just honestly didn't fully understand what that meant. And so there was great learning one day when one of my employees mentioned the fact who lives in Europe and works in Europe, and we were all on a Teams meeting together, and he pointed out the fact that it was the first time since we had all been working together that he actually felt equal in the room, because everyone was on the same platform. Everyone was working virtually. Everyone was on a Teams meeting. And in the past, our international colleagues had always felt like they were kind of, visiting into or looking into a room or a meeting that was happening in Charlotte or happening, wherever that might be. And that was such a huge aha for me that says, I get it. And I think a lot of us had an aha that says, we get it. This is way deeper than what we thought it was. And so we started to have a lot of conversations about that and said, how do we learn from this? How do we learn from that aha to make sure that we kind of equalize? This isn't about being sensitive. This is about making everyone who's not sitting in the Charlotte headquarters feel like they're included. And what exactly does that mean? And so we're still having conversations. We haven't solved that issue, but it has started to challenge our culture a bit in starting to think about people distributed across 56 different countries in a very different way, and kind of what their lens into the company might be. So it was a huge learning for us. And then so we've been doing pulse surveys. We're trying to be way more mindful to listening and thinking about the information that we're getting differently. Luckily we put all kinds of effort, like many of you, and I know my fellow panelists did also, in addressing and responding to and kind of protecting people in the pandemic and COVID. And so we did pulse surveys, and we've done a number of those sorts of things to see how our people are feeling, whether they feel that we've been successful and that they see the leadership of this, and then also understanding how our people managers are responding to this around the globe. We found we had pockets of people managers who went into micromanagement mode when they couldn't manage on site and they now had to manage virtually. Then they changed their leadership styles, just now start to kind of micromanage because they didn't know how to manage people virtually. So we've been pulsing, trying to listen more. We've refreshed our values and our competencies, and are now redeploying those. We changed the way that we thought about those to incorporate some of our learnings, and hopefully that's starting to come through with our employees. But it's an evolution, but there were some pretty significant learnings that I think have started to change the way that we're thinking about how we approach our culture in a very, very international organization. So, but anyway, I'm anxious to kind of hear, my panelists' other responses to this question, because I thought it was a great question.
Well, and Robin, I know you're eager to answer this for us too, and I think you might have even brought some of your own slides with you, because you were talking about values and culture in our first question. So interested in hearing your response to this item too.
Great, thank you. Interesting to hear Terry say, a little bit of dumb luck timing wise. Maybe a similar situation here at CommScope. We acquired a very large company about 18 months ago, and we're really an amalgam of a lot of acquisitions. And so, ironically, many of us have heard culture eats, strategy for breakfast. We've been hearing that for years and years, but really in the last 12 to 24 months, boy, my board members are talking about it. They're talking about it at the NACD level, the importance of culture. And so when we acquired this company, it was very intentional that we would redefine kind of who we are as a collective body and start from the very beginning. And so I thought I would share some of that with you, because it really helped, us. We defined a good bit of it before the pandemic, but we really started giving birth to it during the pandemic, as we otherwise would have. And so if I could ask for the first slide, just to give you the framework, right? You got to have the right strategy. But this was all, if you step back and say, the other thing that's really important today is there a higher order purpose, right? So what's your purpose, your vision, your values, and things of that nature. You've got the strategies that, on the right-hand side that you're trying to, of course, align to. And so we went on this mission to define that higher order, again, pre-pandemic, what the purpose, what the vision, what the values were. And we used, all the conventional. This wasn't the executive team by any stretch. It was hundreds and hundreds of managers and transformation ambassadors and all of that. And so what it helped us to do, because we were able to give birth to this really kind of during the pandemic, it really is about, unifying, aligning, mobilizing your team and giving them confidence about how to behave and how to act and what is valued and what the rewards systems are aligned around. And so, the next couple of slides really will just to show you the end result. So the next slide helps you to understand, again, what each one of these things do for you. And, we've been telling the organization, we've been working on these things, and it was important to them too, because, we all want to be successful. So that's just a look of what each one of those are. The last one, this ways of working, we are just giving birth to right now. Those are the actual behaviors, the competencies. And so the finished product on the next slide, which is again, our drumbeat, here's our purpose. We create lasting connections. You can see what our vision is and our values, right? And so now, as whether we're announcing new organization programming, or whether we're have an org announcement about people, it's always aligned to all of these different elements. And so the next slide here, takes it, I think, a little bit deeper. So this ways of working is, every word matters. And so this is now going to be embedded into all of our people systems. And so next slide, I think, shows that final look of, how it kind of, as we were integrating this acquisition at the same time, because we had two of everything. And so ultimately we needed to provide that guidance around the North Star about, what people need to align towards. And so I think that's the last slide there we can pull apart. But my point is that it was fortuitous, that we were able to do the drumbeat for the organization and just continually kind of put this in front of folks, because now they're all, except for our essential workers, 17,000 of them are showing up in factories and distribution centers and in the field, but 13,000 of them who are at home staring at a screen like this, wanting to be successful, looking for not, let me figure it out. Let me, hopefully the organization's going to guide me how to be successful in this new environment. And at the same time, while we're, telling people, what matters to us and what is going to help us to enable our strategy and bring, value to this new organization that we've brought together. And so I guess my advice would be, because, prior to this initiative, I'd really never birthed a really larger scale culture initiative. And, with ESG and, again, this higher order kind of purpose, and the next generation workforce, it's really, if you haven't, it's really important that you get clarity around it. And, and it is, how you mobilize your teams and think about all the elements within your talent systems that, that absolutely, are mutually reinforcing. And again, if they're enabling your strategy, that's going to help enable your success. And so anyway, I'm so thankful we've had that. So anyway, thank you.
I'll ask you a quick follow-up on that, because you were talking about behaviors. So if you think about the expectations of your leaders and the events, the overlap of the events with the first half of the year, what additional expectations of leaders or capabilities of leaders kind of surface for you as being critical and important?
Yeah. So, what, the most profound one to me, which, it's something that you kind of assume, but we know it really isn't there universally, is trust. It was a leap of faith, everybody, you pushed a button and it was literally everybody go home and we stand everybody up. And ultimately, that has been, heavily debated for probably decades is, are they really working when they're at home? And so all of a sudden we all were. So I would say the two core elements of, the new expectations were really around trust and empathy, right? Is that the level of crisis and how it was affecting people varied completely, on a case-by-case basis, where you were, what your family circumstance, do you have friends or neighbors who can help with kids? Do you have an underlying health condition? And so I'd say that T&E is the new T&E, because there ain't no T&E otherwise. In terms of, you will stand out. I mean, we will know. We did a lot of pulsing very quickly. I was walking like in week 3 of, work from home and going like, oh my God, we haven't asked people, are you okay? How are you doing? And so then we started that rhythm around and we'd know, right? We'd know if you're kind of left out there. We were managing it at a higher order level around this bigger core, drumbeat and culture, but at a, person by person basis. Trust and empathy were absolutely central, and flexibility. And that is still the name of the game. And I think that's a muscle that we've got, we've got to keep, we got to earn, continually, because at some point people are going to have choices. And, how we did during this is absolutely going to be, something that we live with for decades to come.
That's great. And I love the idea of sort of increased EQ as part of the leadership capability going on. Camila, to that point, if you think about how the events of 2020 might have changed your approach to managing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, what would you sort of add to what Robin's saying about leadership characteristics and other things that have helped you change your thinking around that?
I mean, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think this was a moment of reckoning in corporate America. I mean, the allowance for leaders to really have a real kind of confrontation with their own perspective on what diversity means, not only in the context of being a leader, but also within the context of themselves as human beings, and also as they lead organizations. And so I think the moment from a leadership perspective was really interesting. And the approach that we took was to really just use this as a moment of deep reflection and listening and learning, and to take this moment as not to really start to take action, necessarily immediate action, but to use this as a moment of reflection. And we also align that to how we thought about and certainly help support the organization through what we see as a real convergence of COVID and some real fundamental tipping points within, the kind of world stage. So I think, certainly taking as a leader position to listen, reflect, and then infuse that learning into our path forward.
Yeah, so more emotional intelligence, maybe more inclusivity and awareness as well was what I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that we had to also think about is the impact that some of these things were happening on our workforce, being that we are the Wall Street Journal and we have reporters that are covering these stories. They're also impacted. And so we had to also think about how we would ensure that these things are then reflected in the support we gave employees. And also how we approach this very careful situation, right? And the impact it was having long-term, both within their households and then within the workplace. And so it was a really, I would say a defining moment and a huge shift within our company's culture to really come between the COVID context and with the issues surrounding police brutality and social unrest and economic struggles and the fears of layoff and the impact of COVID that we know is having disproportionately on communities of color. And even certainly as we see now, where we know that women are impacted differently as it relates to them thinking about having to leave the workforce due to being able to support COVID. We really much wanted to listen and hear what employees needed. And so we immediately took on a posture of setting up listening sessions and then having pulse surveys to really understand the needs of our employees and then start to cultivate solutions that would address, a large portion of what they were feeling. And making sure that we put acute attention on making sure we were not losing people in this process and losing employees in this process, as well as our customers and who we were reaching out to in terms of our communities that we serve. So it was a really, I would say, a fundamental shift of how we thought about our audiences, our customers, our readers, but also our employees.
That's amazing. Susan, can you answer for the same question, just a little bit around diversity, equity, and inclusion? I know you've been doing work at Sealed Air around that as well.
Yeah, it's very similar to what Kamala was talking about, is that, suddenly thinking about diversity took on a whole different context when you started to think about the world now that our different diverse population was, we're dealing with. So, think about, parents who are now at home with children who have got to be homeschooled and single parents trying to, do their job as well as try to take care of often school age, younger, children, and those types of challenges. We have 10,000 of our employees who are still frontline, employees going to work every day. How in the world were they managing through some of this? And then, of course, the pandemic was kind of playing out differently in every country, kind of around the world. And so being conscious of that, and there's different levels of support and expectations and all of that sort of stuff. So it really kind of elevated the sheer diversity of our population and the needs of our population, irrespective of kind of things that we would normally think about, like, race and gender and those sorts of things. It just played itself out, very differently. But what it also started to elevate for us is we started having a much stronger conversation around inclusion. and what, from a cultural standpoint, what did inclusion really mean for us, and how would we define that, and like how would we know? I mean, so what is it? How do you create an inclusive culture? And especially in organizations that are naturally so incredibly diverse. When you think around international diversity, not to just even kind of manage the U.S. diversity. And how do we define inclusion, and how would we know success when we see it? And think a little less about diversity and a little more about being a very responsive and attractive place for anybody, any sort of diverse need to feel at home and kind of be at their best. And so we're fast forward, that's still a big conversation we're having. We certainly, there's not an easy answer to that, but I think we're starting to talk more, listen more, and have more conversations about inclusion than we are about diversity in as a concept. So
That's fascinating. Yeah. Camila, let's move into thinking about, we keep hearing this idea that our workplaces, and we've talked about culture, we've talked about inclusion, diversity, equity, our workplaces will never be the same. We're seeing some kind of permanent shift. So for you, what's real versus what's kind of the myth, and what are some of the biggest trade-offs you're having to consider?
I do think they will be very different and they will never be the same, but I think it is a myth that we will never go back into the workplace and have in-person connections. I think that will still be the case. I do think this is a moment to see it in a different light. It has certainly allowed us to pressure test that hypothesis. And we see that there is still a need to come together, but we also see that there is a different way to work. And I think it would be foolish if we don't take this experience as an opportunity to prepare for what that could look like and what that would look like. And also just to see where there's efficiencies and a more nimble way of working that didn't exist before. I definitely resonates with me with Susan, where people now there's an equalizer in the employee experience, and that everyone's on screen for the most part. But we also know that we are losing some of those intimate moments, the water cooler moments, those I can walk down the hall and just have a quick chat. But we also knew that we also were losing people that couldn't walk down the hall because they were in a different geography or time zone. So we want to be able to take this moment to right size and reconcile those experiences. And we also realize that we can do a lot more with a lot less. We probably don't need all the real estate and the footprint that we may have. And we certainly have to see how people team and work together and start to look at roles and job families in a different context. How does the work experience need to get done? And then how do we engage that with our communities in a post-COVID context? So I do think there are, these trade-offs in the immediate present need. People really want to have, when are we returning back to work? And what does that look like? And we are holding into that tension because we simply don't know yet, right? And so there's many dynamics, there's many issues, and we have to stay flexible but vigilant. We were certainly, we have a significant piece of work around how we think about what we call a work 2021 or future of work, and how we come out of COVID. And we're also looking at how different parts of our work will be impacted if we move to a more flexible context, and we're not all having to be in the office at the same time in the traditional sense. What does that mean to one's career? How do people manage? How does one excel in an organization or navigate or become nimble? And how do we think about all of the, I would say, talent and employee experiences that we then have to replicate? And so that's really, really important. And what's the impact it has on women or persons of color? Because we don't want to make sure we create an experience that disenfranchises and then creates another issue. So these are very, really important things that I think now is the moment to examine. And we've taken an approach to really ask the questions of our employees, like, how do you see this experience? What's working? What have you learned? What has been beneficial in this virtual environment? What we should bring forward and what we should lose? And so I think it's a real good moment to engage our workforce, but I do think we will never be the same, but we will certainly hopefully be back in relationship with one another, hopefully very soon.
In some very safe way, right? Yeah, thank you for
In a
that.
very safe way, yes. Yeah. Certainly.
All right, Terry, one more for you, and then we're going to start taking some Q&A from the audience. They're very eager. I'm getting text messages here about the questions they're asking. So, Terry, one more question, certainly directed at you. How have the events of 2020 shaped your approach at attracting, developing, and retaining your top talent in your organization?
Yeah, we've had to really think about the sort of non-traditional ways of going after some of this. So as I mentioned earlier, we made the decision to go forward with opening the largest Krispy Kreme in the world in Times Square. We also simultaneously opened a donut factory and a couple of their shops in New York. And where we would typically be able to mobilize and have large career fairs and mass hiring events that were high touch and in person, obviously that wasn't an option. And so we really needed to think about how to do that differently. And we quickly mobilized and leveraged some really helpful partners that we had already been using, but we're now using in a different way. So Snagajob, for example, helped us do some really powerful virtual career fairs. We had a lot of media buzz through social media from some of the events that I mentioned we've been doing from a brand perspective. So we really figured out how to showcase those on social media and attract attention. We also started to do some virtual interviews, and not virtual in a traditional sense, but when you think about hiring for the donut shops, pushing out a video application, giving applicants a chance to ask questions on their time, on their turf, and video those back to us so that we had a chance to kind of look at that. And I think those are some of the things that while we chose to do them for a unique purpose, those are some of the best practices that I think we're going to keep, because it's going to allow us to scale and really do this in a much broader, more efficient way. From a development perspective, we have the opportunity to come into a situation where you don't have all the answers, and nobody does, because it's uncharted territory. Really enabled us to empower some of our high performing thought leaders around how we think about crisis management. How do we quickly reinvent the shop experience so that we're keeping our employees safe but can continue to service our consumers? How do you rethink drive-through? And then also, we're now really shifting to returning to the offices. So while we kept all of our shops open, we're now looking at how we come back into the corporate offices and trying to think about what that's going to mean. And so the task force and the creative thinking that we've seen come out of people has been amazing. And I think from a retention perspective, it's a couple of things. One is sort of the traditional recognition around some of the extraordinary performance we've seen in these times, and wanting to acknowledge that and recognize that in some of the traditional ways. But it's also needing to do things on the softer side, which is just recognizing where we have high performing talent, where our talent is right now, and meeting them where they are and accommodating those needs, whether it's with flexibility or a part-time schedule or whatever it might be. And I think that's another way of saying you're important to us. We want to understand where you are. We want you to feel supported. And it's doing it in a way that we probably haven't had to think of previously.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I can imagine too that there's a sort of a tension between the corporate jobs and the front line jobs, right? And what's the difference between those two things, and how do you do that in a fair way in the organization too? Listen, ladies, we have lots of encouraging question and answer from the audience. So I do want to move us into that, and I'm going to ask that we try to move through this kind of briskly, because we have quite a few questions actually. But so I'll let you kind of raise your hand when I read this off, and let one or two of you take a shot at it. Our first question is, I've heard executives express fears of another wave of employee distress as the pandemic drags. Is there anything specific for your companies that you're thinking about doing differently this fall or winter to help combat that?
I can jump in and say something around that. So one of the things that we were thinking about in trying to, as we saw this, as we were embracing COVID and trying to help employees feel supported, and the varying needs across our employee base, whether that be childcare, elder care, or simply needing time to deal with what we were seeing as both burnout and even some mental health challenges was to create a safe space for employees to take time off, paid time off each week, allowing them the flexibility. So we are giving our employees, at the start of COVID, we gave them up to 40 hours a month, 10 hours a week maximum, where they 2 times, within a day, they can alternate their time and work time to have the flexibility to manage. Going to the doctor was almost a full-time job, right? Grocery store, it's gotten a lot easier, but as we've now are in the pandemic longer and we see kind of this is extending, we have extended that opportunity. And also it's irrespective whether you have children or not, whether you have a furry baby or whether you have an elder care or you're in a sandwich generation. Everyone has different needs in terms of how they need to manage their lives differently. We want people to feel that they can still lean in heavily, but they're also going to need how to figure out how they're managing. So giving them that time and that flexibility. And then we learned that people felt stigma in taking the time, right? So
Yeah.
how do we create moments where we lead the way, we model that behavior? So I do it with my team, and I use this benefit, and I then tell stories about how successful it's been and how we've been able to allow it to really be a positive for the organization. So that's just one tool that we found to be, quite effective.
Thank you. Robin, did you have a comment as well?
Let's go on to a different question. I think
Okay, happy to do that. All right, so our next question. How do you manage in your communications to balance employee productivity, public safety, and profitability? How do you get the executive team to buy in and align, and how long does that take?
There's a lot in that question.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think about, some of the other questions that we've got in here, including that one that was just answered, because there is a lot of distress and the mental health tail on this is pretty significant. But transparency, I think, is the word of the day, and as is truthfulness. And so, obviously you've got to have an aligned leadership team, and whomever that's going to be, if it's the CEO or the CHRO, that is making sure that we're together, but we're together knocking out, obvious operational kinds of things, but really stepping back and answering some of these, bigger questions. And some of them are tough. I mean, you remember every day the news was, hazard pay, and such, right? And so not everybody did it. And why didn't you do it? And how did you communicate it? And did it, was it an acceptable response? And that was, an interesting one for a lot of us to tackle. But I think, it is about, of course, the executive team, there's an opportunity for everybody to sit around the table and share points of view and beat it up and have an opposing, but then you lock hands. I mean, that is it. You're either aligned or you're against. And the CEO's got to set the tone for that very clearly. And then it's our job to evangelize, right? And it doesn't mean that we're going to make everybody happy, but I think it is transparency and truthfulness. Our last town hall that we did, we used the Teams Live platform where people could write their questions and thousands of people vote, yes, I want it, and it was nerve wracking, but I tell you what, we got, unbelievable scores because, open kimono, and we'll give you the best, response that we can. And a lot of these things we talk about, but it was an opportunity to share, more broadly, and it was outstanding. So I think just, again, not professing to be perfect. And sometimes maybe you make a bad decision, you retrench, and then you may revise, but CEOs got to get that team, the exec team aligned, or, you got a problem, no passive aggressive. And then, you're in business, in the public sector, right, to make money, and you got to balance that. We didn't do hazard pay because we pay people well, period, even in our blue collar jobs. And so they weren't on the front line. They weren't as much more at risk. We had a high confidence level about our decisions. And so I think it's providing the full color around, your decision making. People go, I don't like it, but I understand it. That's what you're shooting for.
I'm with you. Yeah, absolutely. I have another interesting question here. This one says, I haven't heard much on training and development. It seems like a hugely challenging piece in this remote environment. And I can tell you, even from the summit perspective, we've been seeing a lot more coaching, which is more of that one-on-one that you can do remotely, as opposed to trying to do things maybe typically like we would programmatically or in groups. So I don't know who'd like to take this one on, but I'd love to hear your change. Or Robin, I might give somebody else a challenge. Susan, were you gonna pitch into on this one?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, luckily, having a distributed workforce, we already kind of had a platform in which we were working on virtual training, and so online training and that sort of thing. But honestly, there is a significant amount of training. Onboarding was a great example of that, in which, suddenly now where, new hires were coming in, onboarding had always been a face-to-face, sort of environment. And very quickly, it was actually surprising how quickly we were able to rethink how to do virtual onboarding and how to make that work. And all of our partners, training partners and development partners, Summit included, suddenly pivoted also, because they knew that this was going to be a need of their clients, and it was going to be something that we were going to have to figure out. And so, it was much easier to kind of, make some of those transitions than we might have otherwise thought. I mean, and when you don't have an option,
Right.
and you've got to still hire people, and you've got to bring them on, and you still got to get people up to speed, and now you just got to rethink pretty quickly about how you do these things. They may not be fully elegant, but and you're just really upfront. I mean, I think Robin's conversation about being transparent and just allowing yourself to kind of be human and recognize that, hey guys, I mean, nobody's done this before. None of us know how to do this. Let's give each other a little bit of grace. And that for a while was our T-shirt mantra. It's like, let's give each other grace and let's figure this out together. And, we just kind of have. But I think it needs to continue. And we're diving in with our people managers. We're diving in with some of those issues where we feel people can use the help and the training and the development to help them kind of be more effective right now in the circumstances that we currently have.
I think that sense of authenticity has become very real, especially as we have dogs and children and everything else that might be in the background of every Zoom meeting we have, right? We've become maybe a little bit more graceful about just accepting real world interruptions as these things happen too.
Hey, Corinne, I'd love to just make a couple of quick comments, because there's obviously a lot of learning that's going on. Actually, it was an article that I read that Bain published a couple of months ago that, I had the light bulb moment. It was about what have we learned through this pandemic, and what are those things that at every level of the organization, what are we not doing? We're not using main phones, and we're not doing this, but there's other elements of our jobs that have all changed. How do you document that? And so what we're going to do is, we had formal development programs. We have a whole lot of alumni out in the organization. So we're going to activate our alumni network, because we can't do I don't have any funding for the other stuff, right? And we're going to pull them together into little tiger teams, and we're going to send them on missions. And people want to meet new people, right? And so we're thinking we'll not only breathe life into a whole lot of folks as they're out on this learning mission around, number one is, hey, what have we learned through the pandemic? What are the processes, things that we've sped up, we've not done anymore? How do we make sure we don't revert back? We're going to take another group of them, and we're going to help them go out and do a DEI mission for us, right? Instead of HR, we're going to take our hypos, have them go out and survey, take a look at, policies and people and our partners, and look at it from a lens of, diversity, equity, inclusion, and say, maybe some of you have read about the master and slave language in software, that's the old, kind of nomenclature. And so we're going to breathe life just by activating people that, otherwise have been involved in some of these programs. We've also bundled learning, and learning isn't just doing a webinar, it's doing things. And so we created that a couple of years ago. I have a couple thousand people, and you just basically give them the breadcrumbs, in terms of, you got to do this, you get a point for all these things. So with YouTube and TED Talks and all those things, you guys can pull together free assets in a bundled way and say, and then we put a certification around each of those. So I think there's a lot of creative things you can do without the formality.
For the learning and development. Thank you, Robin. Well, listen, we have gotten through our hour very quickly. And I have so enjoyed this, and I would love to continue to listen with you all. But on behalf of Summit Leadership Partners, I want to personally thank all 4 of our distinguished panelists for their time and expertise. And to everyone else who joined us today for this discussion, we hope you found the session enjoyable and informative. We'll be sending this recording along with a brief survey to you, so please be looking for that in your inboxes tomorrow. And Summit will continue to offer new relevant panels and webinars in our future, so we look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, please stay well. Thank you.